I'm Courtney Porto, and I teach through Arts for All. Today we are going to do just a simple watercolor fish project, something that you can do at home with minimal materials. And we're going to learn a couple techniques with watercolor, and the main one being wet on wet. And I guess we'll get started. Okay, so for the technique of wet on wet, the first thing we need to do is get the paper wet, like we said. So you're actually just painting a little water on the plain paper with no color. And what this is going to allow the paint to do is kind of have a mind of its own and bleed throughout the paper. So it's a very loose way of painting, and it's a lot of fun with watercolor. It kind of just allows the medium to take over. So now that I have the paper, at least half the paper kind of wet, I'll just wet whatever color I want to do, just gently. And as I add it to the paper, there we go. So see how it's starting to run on its own? I make a mark and then it kind of just spreads out through the rest of the paper. And that's what we're going for. This project is not meant to be realism. It's not meant to be anything that's really detailed. It's just about patterns and color and just showing what watercolor can do. So right now I'm just doing some simple straight lines, and I can add a second color to it, and it will start to bleed together with the first color. So you want to be kind of mindful of what colors you're picking, because if you know color theory, certain colors will make other colors and other ones will make kind of like a mucky brown. So we want to stick with colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So for example, red and orange. But we don't want to do colors that are what they call complementary colors that are across from each other in the color wheel, because they will make like a mucky brown. So blue and orange would be an example that if we did that together, it would make brown, unless that's what you're going for, but I tend to go more for brighter colors. And if you're not that used to color theory and when I'm talking about the color wheel, an easier way to keep your colors from getting brown is just to do blue, or just to do cool colors next to cool colors and warm colors next to warm colors. So now that I've added just a few stripes over there and they've kind of bled together, I'm going to wet this part of the paper. And I'm going to start adding some patterns and things and some other textures. So a couple examples would be polka dots or zigzags or swirls. You can do whatever you want and kind of just experiment, and they might not stay exactly how you started, which is what we want. So I'll start adding maybe some green over here. We'll see if I can do some dots. Watercolor paint is traditionally pretty cheap, which is great, but you still can't tell the difference between really cheap watercolors and not so cheap. So if you want to go for the watercolor that's a couple bucks rather than $1, your colors will be a little brighter and they'll show up a little bit better. So I'm adding some dots. I'm going to try adding some of this black, or is this, yeah, try adding some of this over here. And you'll see the paper is starting to bend a little bit. That's why we want to use watercolor paper rather than just plain printer paper, because it'll do less of that. As the paper gets really saturated, it will still bend a little, but if we were doing this on really thin paper that wasn't meant for watercolor, it would start to wrinkle. And if you're really worried about it, you can tape it down on the edges, and that helps a little bit, but I don't mind the running effect. The yellow is not showing up as well for me. If your yellow shows up, that's great, but I'm going to avoid it just because it's hard for everyone to see. So now that we've done that, we can move on to this one. And this one we're going to do just regular watercolor. We're going to not do wet on wet, so it won't bleed so much. We will just make some random lines and patterns. Again, this doesn't have to be anything that looks marvelous on its own, because when we're going to combine it at the end, it will take care of itself. So I like doing lines a lot. Some people like do some like circles. And it's okay if they start to overlap and bleed into each other a little bit. We want to try to fill both of the papers, because the more that we have filled, the more options we're going to have for the rest of our project for later. Because if I do something I don't like, I don't have to use it. Let's see if I can add, maybe see if we can get any of these watercolors to work for this. Some of these watercolors are a little bit old. We'll stick with these ones, I guess. So I see how it's bleeding like that? That means it's one paint is running into the other paint. And that's one of the fun things about watercolor, is that it kind of starts to make its own blended colors. So then I'm going to I'll do some arches maybe. And I'll try doing maybe some zigzags. And you can mix your colors in your trays as well. It might frustrate you later, but it's also an option. So I'm just kind of filling the paper, and for the ease of time, I have brought some examples that I've already done, because the next step after you fill all your paper is we want it to dry. And so that shouldn't take too long, but for this demonstration we didn't want to have to wait, so I'll show you the ones that I've made for the next step of the project. So you understand the idea. You would keep going, probably do 3 to 4 sheets, and ideally cover the whole paper, and you can even go back over what you've done. So once this one starts to dry a little bit, we could go back and start doing some other patterns over what we've done. So you want it just to be filled with marks and patterns, circles, and whatever you can think about. So that's my demonstration on the first part of the project. Now we're going to pretend that these have dried and they turned out like my other ones over here. So these are the ones that I did in advance to give you an idea of what they should look like when they're dry. So, pretending we've waited for those to dry and they've turned out like this, the next step is going to be to flip them over and draw a simple, and when I say simple, I mean very simple fish on the back. So I'll start with, let's do this one. And this fish does not have to be realistic. The point of this is to be like decor art or something that's representational of a fish rather than an actual realism detailed fish. So you don't have to feel self-conscious if you're thinking, how do I draw a fish? I would usually look at an image reference because that's what I'm most comfortable with. But for this, I'm just going to draw very simple fish. You can draw the top fins and stuff if you want, but you don't have to. I mean, you can literally make it just a very simple fish. So there's my fish. The next thing I'm going to do is cut it out. You can be as detailed as you want. If you want to start adding some of the texture in the fins, you can. But honestly, this works just as well if you just do the generic, almost goldfish style fish, like the cracker. Okay, so we can see that I've drawn my fish, I've cut it out. I'm gonna flip it over, and suddenly it looks like a pretty cool design. So if we had a big sheet of paper, we could put it on there, and suddenly we have a piece of art. But what I'm going to do, rather than just doing one, is I'm going to make 3. And then we're gonna start layering on top of them to make them even more unique. So I'm gonna draw another fish. I'm gonna make mine all the same. You can do yours different or the same. So I'm gonna just trace around this in the back of this other piece of paper so that they're exactly the same. They don't have to be. You can get as creative as you want. So I've traced it again. I'm gonna cut it out again. So now we have 2 fish. And we're gonna do it one more time to make 3. And you can make 1, 2, 3, I mean, you can make however many you want, but I thought 3 looked good compositionally. So I'm gonna do one more. The thing I like about drawing it on the back of the paper rather than the front where you can see the colors is the surprise aspect. I think it's kind of fun when you flip it over and you actually get to see what it looked like. If you wanted to, you could obviously draw on the front and know exactly where you were planting your fish, but I kind of like the surprise. Okay, so we have our 3 fish. Let's see here, make sure I have them all the same direction. Our next step is going to be to layer onto them. So this is where this other piece of paper comes in, or these other ones I've done. We're gonna add extra patterns and designs on top of our background. So there's lots of different options you can do. You can add stripes, you can add circles, you can add triangles, you can add any sort of shape you can imagine. You can also just block off part of the fish, like maybe I wanna make the head a different color, or just the tail. And the way we would do this is I'm gonna start out doing some stripes. So I'm gonna pick, I kinda like this part of my painting. I think this is interesting. So I'm gonna cut some strips of this part. So I'm gonna add it, I think, to this part, because I think this part is a little bit bland. There's not a lot of color there. So I'm gonna start adding these on top of the fish. So this is where the glue is gonna come in. There are a couple different ways you can do it. I am going to glue it first and let it overhang like this. And then once it dries, I'll flip it over and cut off the extra. The other way you could do it would be to try to flip it over this direction and trace them so you know exactly where they're gonna be. But I think that's a little bit more complicated. So I'm gonna take my glue. I'm going to use a paintbrush to apply the glue. And this works pretty well. The only thing you need to be careful of if you do this is to wash the paintbrush very thoroughly afterwards, because it can obviously damage the paintbrush. So I'm just painting a little bit of glue on here. I'm going to press down firmly, evenly. I might apply this one right to the fish so I know that I'm not going to paint a whole bunch of extra. This would work the same if you had a glue bottle that wasn't clogged. You could just draw a little line. And if there's a little bit of extra that bleeds out, I just use my finger and wipe it off and then wipe it on my spare paper. And these don't have to be perfectly evenly spaced. If you're kind of a perfectionist and you want that order, you can, but I am okay with them not being the exact distance apart. Okay, so you can see that these are hanging off of the fish, and that is totally okay. That's what we assumed would happen. So it's gonna look like this. Now right, like this. So ideally we would let it dry first, but since we're making a video, I'm gonna just try to cut them out wet and hope that they don't slide too much. So we're just snipping off the excess in the back of the fish. Try to cut as close to the edge as you can. You can also use, let's see, one of mine came off, that's because I'm immersing it. You can also use an X-Acto knife if you're really careful to do this part, but I prefer scissors. So we have some overlap here in the tail. Cut that part off as well. Again, like I said, the best thing to do would be to let it dry so it's not moving around on you like mine is. Let's see, there you get the idea of how pretty it starts to become when you start adding the extra layers. So I'm going to do one more. I'm going to add, I think I'm going to do the head on this one a different color. So I'm going to pick out, I think, this part of this painting because I really like this part. I'm just going to kind of cut out a square in general. Okay, so I want this part to go over here. So I'm trying to decide which direction I want it to go. Maybe this direction, but I want to make this a little, actually maybe I'll even add some scales. So this is going to go there. So I've got it kind of planned out where I want it. So now I'm going to glue. Put a little bit of glue on this head. Sure it's evenly. So again, ideally you'd let that dry, but for the ease of time, I'm going to cut it out. You can see in the back. And the glue doesn't actually take that long to dry if you're doing this at home. By the time you're working on a different section, it'll be dry enough. See? So now I have that fun little head. So you could keep going as much as you want. If you love it without the layers, you can leave it alone. Or you can add, there's all sorts of ways you can add little pieces. You could add shapes and circles. And then on top of, after you're all done with all of that, the last step is going to be mounting it on one big piece of paper or canvas. So I'm going to arrange these on here. And I will glue them down and you'll have your final piece. And if you want, you can have them swimming different directions, or you can have them all swimming the same direction. So for the last bit, put some glue in the back of the fish. I'm going to get a bigger brush for my glue. And not every single section has to be covered in glue. As long as you have enough, it should hold down perfectly for you. If there's a little excess, you can just wipe it off, put it back in the bottle, put it on another fish. Because you don't want this to be like dripping with glue. You just want a nice thin, even coat. Which would be a little easier to do without the lid. So we're going to put this one right here, push it down. At the very end, just to make sure it really stays weighted down, I'm going to flip it over and put something nice and even and flat on it, just to kind of weight it while it dries. So some good examples would be some old books, or even just like a pencil case, anything that you have that you can kind of just put on it, or a notepad to kind of keep it flat. Got a little too much there. Scooping it back in. Like I said, the brush method actually works pretty well, other than you just got to be really careful to thoroughly wash your brushes out afterwards. Trying to center it. So then last but not least, our last fish. And there you have it. Simple watercolor fish art project.